Hi and welcome to part 2 of Delaware County Political News Meet the Expert. I am your host, Larry DeMarco, and we are here with Brett Burman. If you have not seen part 1, please be sure to see that first before watching this video. Thanks for joining. I am Larry DeMarco, your host. Tell our viewers about the research that you did for the county campaign, the Democrat county campaign.
My research and work for the countywide campaign fell into really 2 areas. One was pay-to-play, which is, for those who aren't familiar with the term, requiring campaign donations from small business owners or people affiliated with businesses, executives, since corporate donations are prohibited in Pennsylvania, requiring those informally, of course, in order to get contracts awarded by the county. Delaware County has an annual budget of in excess of $330 million a year. And so getting a county contract can be worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to businesses. And something that was talked about throughout the county for years apparently, including when I got involved, was that there was this patronage tax, that people were required, in essence, to make these campaign contributions, and they got contracts that were on terms more favorable, perhaps, than they should have been. Unfortunately, no one had really done the legwork to gather the evidence and the documents to prove this sort of thing. It was just sort of assumed and known. So part of what I did, and one of my main tasks, was working particularly with Bonnie Friedman on gathering through right-to-know requests all of the information about how these contracts were being awarded, how much money, who they were being awarded to, and then cross-referencing that with campaign finance filings, which was the second major area that I researched. Campaign finance filings are for the state and every county except for Delaware County available online. However, Delaware County, as of yet, does not make any of its campaign finance filings available online. It is the only county to do that, and that's related to that issue with opacity and lack of transparency that I mentioned earlier. Now, many local committees, campaign committees, and candidates are required to file with the state too, and since the state puts them online, they're available. But any local committees or local candidates that only have to file with the county, you have to go in person to the Bureau of Elections and request those reports in person. Unfortunately, aside from not making them available online, they also have no database listing all of the different campaign committees. So if you don't know the name of the committee ahead of time, there's really no way to find it. In Pennsylvania, a lot of times a candidate will have their name in it, and so it'll be friends of so-and-so, which is a good place to start looking. But at the end of the day, a lot of these committees can have, very innocuous and, names that don't necessarily give you an indication of what their actual purpose is. Like Committee for Delaware County's Future is really just a committee through which Republican campaign finance funds are funneled, but without any kind of database, it's difficult to locate that sort of thing.
You mentioned that a lot of this information was available, and it appears that it was critical in turning the 2017 campaign. Why wasn't this used before?
It wasn't used before because the legwork had not been done to find, collect, aggregate, and analyze all of this different information. I can't speak as to why that hadn't happened because I wasn't involved with any of the previous campaigns, but at the end of the day, in 2017, I and a couple other people committed to doing the legwork in terms of time and doing the financial outlay required to do all the work to get this sort of information together, get it together in a way that was accessible and that could be used and that allowed the sort of conclusions that people had assumed for many years, if not decades, but that hadn't had proof readily available for.
What was the financial output, and what was the time commitment that you exactly put into it?
Financial output was substantial. It was very big. I can only speak for myself and say that it was in the hundreds of dollars. And certainly I'm sure that other people, especially if you speak to them, will be able to attest to that. I know that Bonnie Friedman in particular probably spent a good deal more than that. In terms of time, that is inestimable. I certainly wasn't clocking in and out, but I can tell you that there were many, many, many nights up until the wee hours of the morning, against my better judgment. The next morning, I can tell you, just sifting through the documents we get, because you're talking about hundreds of pages, and it requires you to cross-reference a million different things and keep a lot of information, things that you'd seen previously, suspended in your head, and things like going through campaign finance reports and the right-to-know requests. It's just, I can't even begin to estimate them. I would say it was not quite a full-time job, but it was, you're talking at least 15 to 20 hours a week during the height of the campaign that I spent working on this, often late into the night. And I can tell you that when you do this kind of stuff, at least for me, you'll start working on this stuff, going through stuff, taking notes about it, marking it up if you have it printed out, and then you'll look up and it'll be 2:30 in the morning, and you'll wonder, my God, I have to get up in a couple hours. So
the team was you, Bonnie Freeman. What other volunteers were there putting their heart and soul into the right to know request documentation that came back from the county?
Bonnie worked with a couple people, including some, I believe, that she paid out of her own pocket. Some were volunteers. But I would say that I worked primarily independently on my own. Bonnie and I were the two. I don't believe I'm leaving anyone out, but again, Bonnie and I were really the two people who headed this up. There were other people, including people, staff for the campaign and interns for the campaign, who helped with some of the more nitty-gritty, might call it busy work almost, of kind of, again, aggregating this stuff. But for the most part, all of this was done by us personally, mostly to save money, because ultimately, for other people to do it, you have to pay them, and we were already outlaying so much money as it was, and so I would say that that's it. But there were some other people involved.
What requests did you make?
Oh goodness, I can't go over all of them, but a lot of the requests that we made.
Summarize them.
They were primarily oriented. The right-to-know requests, in particular, were oriented towards that pay-to-play question of how deep the pay-to-play culture in Delaware County, particularly at the county level, went. And so our requests to the county, to school boards, and to municipal governments were oriented at finding out where they were sending their money for their attorney's fees, for where they were buying their hardware and stuff from, electronic hardware, where they were contracting out financial services, things of that nature. Not all of the information we ended up requesting ended up being useful. That's another thing that people have to remember. You're not necessarily always going to find something. This is where that time commitment comes in, because if they had everything, nicely set up, for you, it would be a lot quicker. But they don't. You can't submit a request for all the pay-to-play documentation or anything like that.
It sounds like it was a fishing expedition to some degree.
That's the nature of this sort of thing, is you go on a hunch where you suspect the bodies lay, so to speak, where there's some smoke to try to find the fire. And yeah, you have to go fishing. And I think that it's a lot like what you might expect to be done by local journalists. But unfortunately, I think partly through lack of resources and partly through lack of interest, the local media in the Philadelphia area and in Delaware County hasn't bothered to do this sort of stuff. That would be an organization that would have, more resources, because that's their job, at their disposal, and the time to do this sort of stuff. But again, this sort of information has been available in some way, even if it requires a lot of time, for many years now, since the right to know law was passed, really. This is the first time that it's coming out.
In summary fashion, a lot of it made the news. What information did you find?
Again, there's quite a lot of stuff, but on the pay-to-play front, what we found was, in one sense, nothing that we didn't expect. It was exactly what people had been saying.
Or nothing that you didn't already know.
Exactly, but again, it's how you know, whether you know something through
word of mouth, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's almost like an old wives' tale, because I have relatives in other parts of Pennsylvania who've heard of Delaware County, who are Republicans. Most of my relatives are Republicans, who've heard of Delaware County and how they really have a stranglehold financially on the county. And so it's this sort of wisdom that's been passed down, but that I think voters, understandably, and I think voters should expect some hard information when you're making accusations of this nature. And we found, unsurprisingly, and again, this goes with the campaign finance stuff, which there's a whole bunch of stuff there that I haven't gotten into, that the sort of people who were making contributions were the ones who were getting contracts. In many cases, they were getting these contracts awarded by county council 1 or 2 weeks after their campaign donation had been made to the councilors or to the Delaware County Republican Party. Sometimes that contribution was made 1 or 2 weeks after the contract was awarded. But would that hold up in court, let's say, beyond a reasonable doubt? No. But when it happens over and over and over again, people, I think, can judge for themselves what's really going on here. The public isn't stupid, and that's why the county in particular has gone to such lengths to keep this sort of information from the public. The other thing that we found was the amount of self-dealing that was going on between the county government and its elected officials. Elected officials, including Dave White, one of the Republican candidate, the incumbent who lost his bid for re-election, had, both prior to his time in office and despite what he says during his time in office, received business from the county before it was directly through the county. Afterwards, it was subcontracted through the county. And that's one of the big things. There's no way of telling, without making these sort of right-to-know requests, who's getting money through subcontracts. Because a lot of times the county will contract with someone and then some of that work will be subcontracted out. The county has that information, but it's not made publicly available. And so these right-to-know requests are necessary in order to get that sort of information, which I believe, and I think most people would agree, should be made publicly available, because there's not a great cost involved in just making some of this information. I'm not talking about every single document that passes through the county being made publicly available online. I'm talking about the vital information, who's getting which contract. Prior to 2017, prior to 2016, the minutes for county council meetings were not even in searchable form. They were simply photocopies. And so they couldn't be searched through the website, through Google or anything like that. And so you had to literally read through each and every one in order to know what was in it. That's one of the things that we put into these databases. Eventually, one of the things I did for Bonnie and for the other campaigns was purchase the text recognition feature of software that allowed me to go through all these PDFs over several hours of computing to make them searchable documents, essentially. I did submit them back to the county and say, hey, you guys can use these. They're a little bit more useful for you. To my knowledge, last I checked, they still have not replaced the documents with the searchable versions.
Brett, how was this information used by the county campaign?
This information allowed the county to go out and publicly, through the media and through other public forums, make very specific statements about the pay-to-play culture, the lack of transparency, and the need especially for ethics reform in the government. prior to this, in prior elections, if you go back and read news articles, they use these keywords like transparency and things related to pay to play, but without being able to make specific, site-specific examples of why we needed a change.
Or reference any documents.
Say, listen, we have proof and it's on our website, go check it out. Understandably, people would think that is the sort of thing that a political campaign would say. And without any proof, if it's that bad, it's a natural thing to ask. If it's that bad, where's the proof of it, essentially? So it allowed them to go out, put this stuff online and say, listen, we've done more work than we've essentially done the county's work for it on a lot of these issues to make it available to the public. And this is something that should be going on all the time. Okay, it shouldn't be up to a political campaign.
Brett, from my own personal knowledge, from having been part of a county campaign in 2011 and 2015, without this information, the Democratic county candidates would lose from somewhere between 6,000 to 10,000 votes without this information. Then with basically you and Bonnie Friedman and whatever assistance you guys had.
Oh, no, it wasn't just us, but yeah.
Sure, whatever paid assistance, but you guys putting in basically a second full-time job, researching this and whatever expenses that went into this, freeing up the candidates to be able to discuss and reference with specificity. It made the difference between approximately a 10, 11,000 vote difference, put them over the top, and allowed county row office candidates and county council candidates to sweep the whole board.
I really believe that, without question. A lot of the national media missed that in their discussion about this. They said it was all because of Trump. Does Trump turn out a little bit more Democrats? Yes. And without this information, would we have lost, I think, by a little bit less than we normally would have because of Trump? Yes. But ultimately, what swung the election, what was decisive, were the Republicans who turned out and voted for the county-wide and even often locally municipal for the Democratic candidates. They flipped, in other words. And normally that is where the Republicans' strength is. They turn out their own voters, they all vote Republican, and that's how they are able to maintain power in the county and in many municipalities, despite being outnumbered on the voter registration. What you saw was, at least, for instance, in the county race, 2,000 to 3,000, which might not sound like a lot, but it's a swing, kind of double that number, because these are Republicans who normally turn out, 2,000 to 3,000, who came out and instead of voting for Republicans like they normally do for countywide and even for the local offices, they switched those votes to Democrat. Because, and to me, the line that was quoted in the news from just a regular Delaware County citizen that sums it up best is the person being interviewed said they need to get some new blood in there. And I think that reflects this sense of finally acknowledging, local Republicans, many of them acknowledging that the county government is not functioning the way that it should. It's not functioning for our benefit. And there's too much smoke for there to not be some fire here, given how much stuff the Democrats have and how much they've made publicly available. That was what's key, because the Republicans got about as many votes as they normally do. But their turnout was up a little bit. Those extra Republicans voted for the Democrats, who got about 15,000 more votes than any other Democratic candidate had, at least 15,000 more votes than any other Democratic countywide candidate had in the history of the county.
Brett, you said during election season you probably had another part-time or full-time job, maybe 20 hours a week or more. You bought software, you made some right-to-know request expenses. Have you been reimbursed for all your out-of-pocket expenses?
I've been reimbursed for none of them.
What have you been paid for all your time?
In kindness and thanks.
Brett, why did you do it all?
When I started to get involved, I wanted to get involved because I wanted to help the community, and I kept hearing about all of these things. I had no idea how bad Delaware County was, and I kept hearing pay-to-play, patronage tax, and I kept looking around and asking okay, so this is happening. I believe you that it's happening. Where's the proof of it, though? And I was genuinely shocked to find that there really wasn't any. And so on my own, kind of individually, not even really to benefit the campaign directly, I started looking through things that were available, like campaign finance filings. This is before I even got into the right to know requests. And it became very apparent to me that it was even worse, in a sense, than I had thought it could be. That they weren't even, the Republican establishment wasn't even trying that hard to cover up what they were doing, because you have, for instance, Dave White not putting any of the employer information on his campaign finance filings for his largest donors, which is, they're required to at least ask for it, and most campaign finance filings have most of their donation lines have that information. Why wouldn't they do that? Because most of those big donations came from companies, people associated who own companies that get contracts with the county. And it was so absurd even that when I went through and filled out this information for him to find out where this stuff was, one of the people whose employment information he apparently didn't know was the president of the company that he owns and founded, DW3. Now, it's hard to believe that this sort of thing would go on, campaign finance filing after filing, without a specific agenda, a need to hide this sort of stuff, which is, exactly what we found. But like I said earlier, when there's that much smoke, there's got to be a fire. And as this became apparent to me, and this is in the early months of the campaign, say mid to late spring, it angered me. It really, to be frank, pissed me off that this sort of stuff could go on and that there could be this much contempt for the people whose tax dollars go to fund the county government. And so when I inquired as to how I could contribute some of these findings to the county campaign, because at this point it's just me in my house looking through all this stuff and taking notes about it, which, since I'm not a candidate, doesn't do anybody else any good. That's when I was connected with Bonnie Friedman, and where I also was connected with Joel Kuhn, who at that time had just been brought on board as the campaign manager. And what drove me to help them, because as I said, I was in an unofficial role, I wasn't even reimbursed for my expenses, let alone paid as a staff member, was my firm belief that this sort of thing is wrong in a nonpartisan way. Corruption is not a partisan issue. It's unless you're one of the people who's benefiting from the corruption. And it turned my stomach to think that this sort of stuff could go on without people at least knowing about it.
Brett, you taught for 2 years in the Bronx. We're right outside of Philadelphia. We are sure that this type of pay-to-play goes on in Philadelphia, other political machines like New York, where there are Democratic powerhouse machines, maybe Chicago, California, any type of major Democratic city. We're not going to be so naive to believe that Republicans only are guilty of this, correct?
Absolutely not. And it, to me, is even more, it upsets me even more when Democrats do it, to be honest. Not that it's more acceptable for Republicans to do it, but...
Because you're a Democrat.
Well, and also because the people who are hurt by this sort of stuff the most are middle class and, lower middle class working people, because they're the ones who are paying the tax dollars. It hurts them the most, and Democrats, at least nominally, are supposed to be the party that's really standing up for them. So to me, it's even less excusable for Democrats to do it, and I don't think that the party should give them any cover when it comes to that.
Brett, is your work done?
Absolutely not. In part because Delaware County, despite our election victory, is still primarily controlled by Republicans. They still have a majority on county council, and it's unclear at this time the extent to which they're going to take a clue, get the message that was sent in this election, that they need to start becoming more transparent and less of a party committed to the sort of casual corruption that we've seen from them.
So what's ahead for you and the Democrats in the future?
For me personally, I'm going to continue working both through a not-for-profit, and hopefully with other like-minded people in Delaware County to continue looking through the issues that we found in terms of pay-to-play that on a more long-term basis may continue to be issues. To some extent, we'll have to see how things play out after the election. A lot of boards flipped, and a lot of them are going to be committed to this transparency project. But primarily, the focus is going to be at the county to identify whether there has been a change in operating procedures because they're under the scrutiny of having 2 Democratic council members, or because they take a clue from having lost the election. Beyond that, for me personally, I think that one of the biggest issues that I saw, having taught social studies for 2 years, and granted this was with a New York curriculum, but one of the things that was missing completely from the state curriculum, and I am pretty sure that Pennsylvania is the same case, is a lack of focus on civics in social studies classes. Not necessarily history, which is really what social studies has become, but what it means to be a citizen, what your responsibilities and duties and the obligations of being a citizen are. And in my opinion, one of those obligations is, at least to the extent that you're able, with time, and people can't become experts on everything, but participating in the democratic process, not only by voting, but in keeping an eye, especially locally, on what your government is up to, what the school board is doing. That can directly affect your children if you have them. What your municipal government is doing, because that can affect whether there's, apartment buildings. In Edgemont, where I live, we had a local issue. Democrats are outnumbered 2-1 in Edgemont. Literally 49%. There's 49% as many Democrats as Republicans. Our candidate won for the first time in history for supervisor because of issues surrounding a apartment complex that had been zoned in without any real debate and against popular will by the Republicans who run Edgemont, on the assumption that it's not going to matter because they can't lose.
What advice do you have for other civic activists? Brett, what other tasks did you undertake for the county campaign other than right-to-know requests?
So, as the campaign progressed, and I increasingly worked more closely with Joel Kuhn. Again, this is in an unofficial capacity, volunteer capacity, as a private citizen. Joel became interested in having me develop parts of their policy platform, in particular, those related to solving the sort of problems that we were uncovering with pay-to-play and campaign finance.
And for those who don't know, Joel Kuhn is the manager of the county, the Democratic county candidates. For more information about Joel Kuhn, you can watch my interview with Joel on Delaware County Political News.
So, essentially what I did was put together, this is a copy of the policy proposal that I put together, from which the campaign adapted what they eventually released to the press, because this was written in a very sort of legalistic manner that was not politicized. I'm not really a political operative of any kind, and so Joel had to kind of apply his touch to it.
But what Joel put together for the county candidates really was taken, Brett, from your work.
Exactly. It was more, in some cases it was taken verbatim. Some sections were excerpted verbatim. In others they were simply rewritten to make it a little less legalese. But in all cases it was taken from this.
So you reviewed both, and what you were able to observe is that he used your brain power. He just made it more press
friendly.
Readable, press friendly, but it was basically your brainchild.
Well, yeah, and also, and this was not written for the public. This was written for the campaign to adapt their policy platform off of. So, what I did was look right next door, actually, to New Jersey, which has a pay-to-play law for all government, including local government agencies, and researched that law and adapted that to be applied to Delaware County. Restrictions on whether people who receive no bid contracts can donate to political candidates or political committees. Also, I adapted from other sources transparency regulations, some I just kind of came up with by the seat of my pants, for making available online information about RFPs, requests for proposals, and the contracts that were being awarded and the criteria that were being used. In other words, going beyond the minimum that was required by the law. The other thing was, the other elements of policy included were to help prevent self-dealing. So the policy proposal prohibited county council members from directly financially benefiting or having a company that they have an ownership interest in receiving contracts from the county. And now, that doesn't, the Republican candidates basically felt that was ridiculous, but to me, if you're a public servant, part of the job should be a willingness to forego the opportunity to make money off of the county if you want that added responsibility. Even if you were to be awarded the contract fairly, it's better, in my opinion, that there not even be a question of that.
Well, hold on, Brett. I think by history, both Democrats in those machine areas that you and I discussed earlier, Philadelphia, major cities, let's just say major cities and other locations where you have single party power, and maybe the Republicans through history may have seen that ridiculous. However, during the campaign, did they ever verbally come out with a comment about the ethics proposal?
Their only comment was, Democrats don't understand how county government works, which, as I told Joel when I read that quote, was what they were really saying was they don't really know how county government works. Because, sorry.
I don't know when that came out.
Oh, shoot.
Neither do I.
It probably just came out. But you know what? I was hearing you fine.
Okay.
I was hearing you fine. So let's put that back on. Here's my question. Joel, did they really comment about, I've been watching, it's been fine. Joel, did they really come
Brett.
out with a comment? Brett, did they comment on the
ethics?
Joel, did they comment on that ethics? Joel, did they comment on that ethics proposal?
They basically, their exact quote was, Democrats don't know how county government works, which is not really a response. They had no response to this, which to me is shocking because, and this is why we put in so much work, because if they're not willing to agree to these, to me that shows that they do have something to hide, because all of the proposals were very common sense, and all they said was they don't know how county government works, which, jokingly, I said to Joel Kuhn, the campaign manager, what they're really saying was they don't really know how county government works.
And the ethics proposal discussed county government. However, that really works for all types of government, municipal and borough government.
School districts.
Everything.
Absolutely. To me, the onus is greater on the county just because it's a bigger entity. It's administering a much larger budget, and so and it also means they have more resources to be even more transparent. There is a natural limit to how transparent any organization can be. They can't have every single thing online, and so the smaller organizations, the principles still apply, and it's a question of what can they within their means reasonably make available. When it comes to how they're spending money, especially on the big ticket things, that sort of stuff, to me, is not difficult or costly to make publicly available. Some are very good about making it available, some of the smaller ones. I don't want to suggest that every school district and municipality in Delaware County has struggles with opacity. Some do, some don't. It's the county government specifically that has that issue. But the principles are still the same, and they're actually can be sort of grown up to the federal government. The truth is, for all the issues in Washington, D.C., the federal government has far more transparency regulations, pay-to-play restrictions than Pennsylvania and certainly the Delaware County does. I mean, it's not even, you can't even compare it.
Brett, we're going to leave it there.
Thanks so much.
But I want to thank you for being a guest on Delaware County Political News.
Thank you, Larry. My pleasure to be here.
We have been here with Brett Burman, and I am your host, Larry DeMarco. If you like this episode, please don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe, and forward this link to all the friends on your contact list and Facebook friend. We are signing off. Tune in next time. Bye for now.